Okay, so tonight is the first in a three-part series about the water quality in Rockbridge County. The topic of tonight is the quality of our rivers and streams, and Nesah McRae from the Virginia DEQ is our presenter tonight. One of the things that I didn't get to, of the many things I had to do to prepare for tonight, was to memorize her bio. So you'll excuse me while I read this to you. Currently, Ms. McRae is the Regional Total Maximum Daily Load, or TMDL, coordinator for the DEQ's Valley Regional Office. And if you don't know what TMDL is, it's all right, because I think she'll cover that. As the TMDL coordinator, Ms. McRae works with communities throughout the Shenandoah and Upper James River watersheds to address water quality impairments in Virginia streams. Ms. McRae has a Master's of Science in Forest Resources with an option in watershed stewardship from Pennsylvania State University. She began her career in Virginia's TMDL program as a watershed coordinator for the Department of Conservation and Recreation in 2005. In this capacity, Ms. McRae developed and implemented numerous TMDL implementation plans while also working to enhance the collaborative process used to develop these plans in Virginia, including engaging farmers in discussions about how to increase participation rates in federal and state cost share programs for agricultural best management practices. Ms. McRae has also worked closely with her local government staff to identify opportunities for stormwater retrofits needed to meet TMDL goals and to identify innovative financing strategies. In addition to developing TMDL implementation plans, Ms. McRae works with the regional office on collaborative initiatives to improve water quality in the Shenandoah Valley. In 2008, Ms. McRae completed the Virginia Natural Resources Leadership Institute program, which has been instrumental in facilitating community dialogues about water quality and land use issues and managing conflict. Sounds like she's in the right place, y'all. So we have an expert here tonight. Please help me welcome her.
I forgot how long that was. That wasn't too much, but it's a pleasure to be here. I love Rockbridge County. This is actually my husband's good buddy, but we spend a lot of time down here around Ocean Pass. I think that's Corner Rapid. He spends too much time down there. But so I'm here to talk with you all tonight and give you kind of a big picture overview of water quality in Rockbridge County and the types of things that we're doing as a state agency to address issues that we see in our rivers and streams. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. So I've got basically everything but the kitchen sink in here. So I'm going to roll through things and try and keep it to about 40 minutes to leave time for Sandra. So I may have to skip over some things at the end. We'll do our best. So the first thing I wanted to talk a little bit about are the programs that we have with respect to monitoring as an agency to answer this question of how healthy is my stream. So we monitor little guys like this through our biological monitoring program, which is a program that we use to gauge the overall health of our streams. So we conduct biological monitoring of macroinvertebrates that live on the bottoms of our waterways in the spring and the fall. And we also look at the habitat around our streams to see if it's supportive of critters like this guy. And so we collect all of this data and we run it through a multi-metric index called the Virginia Stream Condition Index. And what this index does, we look at all sorts of different factors, the number of dragonfly larvae, the number of mayflies, stoneflies, critters that we don't want to see in a stream. And we gauge what that tells us, how healthy a stream is. And so that's our index that we use to assess the biological health of our rivers and streams. We also have what we call an ambient monitoring program, and that's where we're looking more at chemical monitoring in our streams, things like dissolved oxygen, nutrients, sediment, pH, temperature. And so that program works a little bit differently than our biological monitoring program, where we have these 6-year windows where we try and hit as many stations as we can within that 6-year window. And we'll typically monitor one particular site either every month or every other month for a period of 2 years within that six 6-year window, and we rotate on and off of those stations every 6 years. We also have what we call trend stations, where we're collecting monthly data for many, many years, most often longer than 20 years that we've been at some of those sites. And those sites are really helpful in doing kind of long-term statistical analyses of how water quality may be changing across the state. And so we use all of this data to determine if our waterways are meeting a series of what we call designated uses. And that's just basically saying that we should be able to use all of our rivers and streams in certain ways, and critters should be able to use them. So recreational use is really for us, and that's saying that it should be safe to recreate, to swim in our streams, to splash, to get waters in your eyes, in your mouth occasionally, things like that. So with that designated use, we're really looking at bacteria concentrations primarily in our streams, and whether or not they're high enough that there could be a chance that you could get sick, usually some sort of gastrointestinal illness or an infection in an open cut if you were to swim in that waterway. Aquatic life use, we're assessing whether or not we're meeting that use when we're looking at the bugs, saying are these streams suitable for aquatic life? And those bugs are kind of the foundation of a whole pyramid of life in our waterways. And so we start down at the bottom, and if we're seeing problems with them, that means we might see problems with fish and with birds and with mammals and so on. So we use them to see if we're meeting that use. Public drinking water supply, that only applies to waterways where we're looking at within a certain distance of a drinking water intake. So that's an important one, again, for us to use our waterways. Wildlife should be able to survive and rely upon our streams. Shellfishing use, so that's the growth and propagation of shellfish. A little less important in our part of the state as it is closer to the shore. And then fish consumption, meaning that if you catch a fish, hopefully you can eat it in our rivers and streams. So those are the primary uses that we're looking at when we're monitoring and making sure we're attaining those. So I mentioned that 6-year window where we're hitting different stations, within that for a period of 2 years. And this 6-year window is used for what we call our water quality assessment. So every 2 years, and it's an even numbered year, so 2016, 2018, 2020, we produce a water quality assessment. And the data that I'm going to share with you all for Rockbridge County this evening is from our 2018 water quality assessment. And that's based on a 6-year data window from 2011 to 2016. And so for Rockbridge County, I mentioned we're rotating around these different stations, trying to get as much coverage as we can. For 2018, we assessed about 20% of the waterways in the county through our monitoring stations. And so of that 20%, I'm estimating about 54% of the waterways that we assessed were found to be impaired for one of those designated uses that I shared with you. Well, 56%, 44% were supporting all of those uses. So I'm going to take you through a brief overview of what those impairments are, where we're seeing the problems. Can everybody still hear me okay? Okay. Sometimes your voice gets tired and you get quieter, so I want to make sure I don't fade out. So there's about 1,800 miles of stream in Rockbridge County, and that number is kind of, you may hear different figures depending on which data set you look at. Yes, sir?
Could you define stream?
And so that's what I was about to say. So 1,800 miles is based on the data that we have through the National Hydrography data set. And that does include intermittent streams as well as perennial. So that's not just perennial. And I like to use the full number in the data set because there's differences in how intermittent streams may be classified in different data sets. So this is big picture. This may be streams that are dry part of the year. Okay, but we're not typically assessing those intermittent streams. That's, you wouldn't go out and sample bugs in a stream that's dry half the year, because you're not going to get a great diverse population there. So we have, and I tried to color code this. Of course, things never show up quite the same, but I think this is a pointer. Yes, okay. So the aquatic life impairments, that's where the bugs aren't what we would want to see, are shown in pink. So one of those is right here. That's the little calf pasture. And there's, this one's pink here. This is pink here, and this is pink here. And here and here. The pink and the red look kind of similar. I'm sorry about that. And so those aquatic life impairments, some of them are what we call benthic impairments, which just means the bugs aren't what we would expect to see, and we need to do more research to understand why that is. And we have a process that I'll explain to do that. We also have a pH impairment where the water quality in the stream, the pH isn't within the range that we would want to see, and a temperature impairment. And most often those temperature impairments have turned out to be natural. We haven't looked into this particular one yet, but that's certainly on our radar. In addition, we've got a 17-mile fish consumption impairment, and that is right here on the Maury River, where we have a PCB advisory for fish. So that's something I'll talk a little bit more about as well. But the primary impairment that we have here, 158 miles of bacteria impairments. And that's been our focus largely with my program over the past several years. We have addressed most of those bacteria impairments to date through our water quality process that I'll go into, but that's going to be your largest impairment. So this map also shows some highlighted watersheds here in yellow and blue, which I'm going to explain a little bit more about. Does everybody follow me okay so far? Okay. So this graph is really big picture. It's a summary, and you can see here on the bottom, there's different stream names. You all may be familiar with some of these creeks. They may go through part of your backyard. So what this graph shows you is data collected between 2011 and as of, I think, last week in our data set for these streams in Rockbridge County. And this red line here is right about at 235 colony-forming units per 100 milliliters of water for E. coli. So that's our water quality criterion for E. coli, where we feel that if we're below that, we're pretty comfortable, it's generally safe to swim or recreate in that waterway. And we allow, usually a stream would be considered impaired by E. coli if you're violating that standard over 10.5% of the time. So we allow a little wiggle room there. You may have a huge rain event and E. coli concentrations are going to spike in your waterway, and that's, you would hope nobody's out there swimming when it's flooding. I know my husband is out kayaking, but that's another discussion. And this last bar here just shows you the average. So in general, you've got a few bad apples here for Hayes Creek, which I'll talk about more in a bit, and Ots drains into Hayes. Not doing so well. St. Walker is in that watershed as well, and then Woods Creeks. So those are cases where we're seeing some problems. And this, I talked about that Virginia Stream Condition Index that we use to say if the bugs are where they really should be to assess the biological health of our streams. And so with that index, we're looking for a score, and this number means nothing to you all, but 60 is our kind of make or break point, where if it's above a score of 60, then we're saying the biological health of that stream is pretty darn good. And if it's below, that's where we start to get concerned. So you can see, I was really excited when I started graphing this. And these, the date ranges that we have for our biological monitoring program vary quite a bit more. So I just graphed what I had for all of these sites. But I was really happy to see that, most of the streams here are either above 60 or right around it for the big data sets that we have. So that's really that was pretty cool. I hadn't done, when I was trying to get Rockbridge County specific data, usually I'm looking at one watershed at a time. So it was neat to see that overall things actually look pretty good. Again, a few problem areas like moors there, little calf pasture is kind of a unique situation with the dam and a lake there that we won't get into, but that was good to see. So how do we address these impairments when these designated uses aren't being met? And we have a process called the Total Maximum Daily Load, or TMDL process. And it's, the acronyms and everything really end up confusing people. But basically, it's just the process that we use when we see a waterway is, our monitoring showing that things aren't good, that we study that stream, we figure out what needs to be done, and then we try and bring resources to a community to address that and to implement. So the first thing that we would do, like if we have one of these biological impairments where we go out, we sample the bugs, and things don't look good, we want to understand why that is. So we're going to do what we call a stressor analysis and try and figure out what's stressing out the bugs. So once we identify what the pollutant is that we're concerned with, whether it's sediment or nutrient, maybe it's nitrogen or bacteria, we would do what we call a total maximum daily load to address that pollutant. So we look at all the sources, how many cows are out in the creek doing their thing, or how much manure is washing off from a pasture, and how much bacteria is in there. So all the sources and their contributions, and then we try and figure out how much do we need to turn those sources down. And there's a number of ways to arrive at that point, turning one down more than another, but we work with the community to figure that out.
Are you talking mostly agriculture versus industrial then?
In this area in Rockbridge County, just based on land use that you have, it's largely agricultural. With Woods Creek, we went through this process, and that's a different situation there where you've got more stormwater in urban areas. So then once we know what reductions need to be made and whatever this pollutant is, then we figure out, well, how do we get at that? How do you reduce cows in the creek by 50%? Usually that's putting up a fence to keep the cows out of the creek. Maybe you're planting trees along the edge of the stream to filter out some of that bacteria and that runoff. So we go through that process of developing what we call an implementation plan or a watershed plan that outlines what needs to be done, what sort of outreach we can do to get the word out about how folks can get involved, what they can do to help, how much it's going to cost, and we develop timelines, funding strategies. They're very detailed documents. And then the last step in that process is to implement. So we have a grant program that we administer. We try and give money to soil and water conservation districts like Natural Bridge, where KIP has represented you all. And we've worked with local governments, with nonprofit organizations like Chesapeake Bay Foundation to give them funds to go out in communities and try and get folks on board to do some of these practices. And that's in the Hayes Creek watershed on a farm at Indian Bottom, where they did a really incredible stream bank restoration project that we got to do a little farm tour there. But that's a beautiful spot. So, I mentioned that map, and I can flip back to it here in a moment and show you all where these watersheds are located. These are the total maximum daily loads, or TMDLs, and associated plans that we've done for Rockbridge County. So this table shows you the watersheds, the type of impairment, so what the pollutant was that we were looking at, when we did the study, the TMDL, and when we did the watershed plan or the implementation plan, and then if we did put together a project where we had money that we brought into the watershed the year that happened. So Hayes Creek was the first implementation plan that we did in Rockbridge. I remember that one vividly because at the final public meeting I was standing up presenting at the Rockbridge Baths Fire Hall, and I remember I was freezing, like shivering, freezing. I had a fleece jacket on. And then I got home and I had 103-degree fever, and I woke up in the morning with the chicken pox. Because I had it as a kid. So I will not forget that meeting. Yeah, and then little calf pasture, I was very pregnant. So these are the projects I don't have time tonight to go into great detail about all of them, but I'm going to share some information about the Hayes Creek project here in a moment. In Woods Creek, we just finished the implementation plan this year. So, and then I'll just go backwards here for a moment. So, this is the little calf pasture, and this is the Hayes Creek watershed. So that Hayes, Walker, Moffitt's, Otts, that straddles the county line with Augusta. Here's Woods Creek, this little one, and then this is the Maury. And actually, this blue here is also the Maury, but we didn't do a full-blown TMDL and implementation plan for all of it, because actually a portion was removed from the impaired waters list. But we still have to deal with that PCB issue. So this is the Hayes Creek watershed in a little bit more detail on a map. And there's some handouts back there that go into a lot of detail about the project. But it's largely agricultural area, almost all agricultural, but a beautiful, beautiful area of the county as well. So this is a snapshot. I mentioned, we look at the pollutant, in this case it was bacteria, and estimate what kind of reductions are needed from all the different sources in order to meet the water quality standard. And in this case, Moffitt's Creek, for some reason, was grouped in with Hayes Creek, so these reductions apply. Now, Hayes Creek, you can see here, so livestock direct deposition is cows defecating in the creek. Cropland, pasture, straight pipes, is everybody familiar with what a straight pipe is? Okay, yeah. No, okay, so that is when a home does not have any sort of treatment system for their
So the
sewage.
cropland is basically, isn't fertilizer then?
The cropland would be runoff from organic fertilizer that's been applied. So I'll tell you, for Hayes Creek, these reductions, 80%, that's, largely, that's going to be really hard to meet. We have to kind of go through this process and show what it would take. But water quality monitoring is really going to measure success in the end. The others, we've been able to accomplish goals like a 40% reduction in livestock in the creek, even 55 with exclusion fencing. That has happened in project areas. So that's certainly possible. And this is what we would estimate we would see in terms of how often that creek's going to spike in E. coli. And this is an acceptable range that we would feel comfortable with. So this table here, there's a lot in here. I'll explain it, but it's also on the handout that's in the back. This is a snapshot of what's included in that watershed plan that gets at how to actually meet those reduction goals. So how do you get there? So for example, this is an interesting one here. This is feet of fencing. So the goal for these watersheds, for all of them in total, would be 353,000 feet of fence. Now that's not feet of stream, that's feet of fence. So it could be on either side. Some streams you may only need to fence one side depending on how that farm's laid out. But that's feet of fence. Let's see, here's 275 acres of riparian buffers. Generally, those are 35 feet back from the stream where you're planting trees or shrubs. Let's see, what else to point out here. These are the septic practices. So 66 pump outs where you're pumping the tank, somebody's system. Here's 90 repairs we estimated, and so on. So you can go through those numbers. So we offered a grant to the Natural Bridge Soil and Water Conservation District. It was a 5-year project between 2012 and 2017 where they had staff that were going out in these watersheds, reaching out to local landowners and offering them assistance to do these practices. Generally, it was in the range of 50 to 75% of the cost of these various things. So they had a lot of challenges with the septic program, and we never really figured out why. In the planning process, it was clear that in Rockbridge County, the need for assistance with some of the septic practices is very, very high. And I don't know what went wrong, but they just didn't have many takers on the septic practices. They did have some success with livestock exclusion in the watersheds and did get a good bit on the ground. You can see, though, I said those goals are high, so this shows the percent of the overall goals that was achieved in that 5-year window. So we would have hoped to have seen a lot more than that, but the goals were very high. I mean, they did get, 31,500 feet of fencing is quite a bit. There's what, 5,300 feet in a mile, so you can do the math there of how many miles of fence that was. And this shows you our water quality monitoring in Hayes Creek at the watershed outlet. So until last year, our trend line actually was going the other way. And what this tells you about bacteria concentrations in our streams is they can vary quite a bit depending on how much rain we have. In 2018, was pretty wild there. We had quite a few very large kind of gully washers, big rain events where we're going to see some pretty significant spikes in E. coli. So hopefully, 2019 will be looking a little bit better than 2018. But generally speaking, things have improved over the years. So that was Hayes Creek in a very, very brief snapshot. And like I said, there's some more information back there about that project. It was a very neat project though. We worked with Washington and Lee University and worked with some of their students to do these really neat interviews with local watershed residents on their experiences with the river, and we had conservation stewardship awards. I don't know if any of you all know Jay Gillum, but he was a real champion of that effort, and we gave him an award, and it was just a really neat group of people to work with and a neat project. So Gretchen had asked me to talk a little bit about the costs of these projects, and like I said, I could tell you about all of these, but we don't have time this evening. But what I do have here is a table that breaks things down in terms of, and BMP stands for Best Management Practice. So that's things like fencing cows out, planting trees, things like that. So this shows you for each of these projects what we estimated to be the cost of agricultural best management practices, residential, or in the case of Woods Creek, we had some urban, and lake management only pertains to the little calf pasture project. That was kind of a unique one there where we were dealing with Lake Meriwether.
Who's responsible for that sum of money? Is it the Boy Scouts, or is it what is it? The federal agency oversees dams and waters? And these plans, I should mention, are voluntary. So, when we come up with these cost estimates and these best management practices, it's up to the landowners to participate or not, and that includes the National Capital Area Council of the Boy Scouts. So that is their burden to bear in terms of if they did choose to participate.
And not to interrupt, on the agricultural BMPs, you have a participating landowner. Typically, when they participate and they receive government money, it's a 12 to 15-year commitment or contract period. Is that fair to say, Nesah? So, I mean, there's a bunch of different ones, and you get variables, but a 12 to 15-year commitment to maintain the practice is common.
Yeah, and that can be a real big impediment. People say, well, it's real simple to put up a fence, just get the cows out. But, you've got to pay for the cost of the practice up front, and then you get reimbursed. You've got to find alternative water, you've got to drill a well. If you don't live near the farm, you've got to make sure you always have power. If your power goes out, your cows don't have water. And you have to maintain the fence. So it might get washed out. It's on your dollar to put it back up. So.
And when you sell that farm in 2, 3 years, 4 years, does the next owner expect it, or does it end there?
There's a transfer of responsibility form that they have to sign to maintain it for the life of the practice.
So the practice goes no matter who's the owner.
If the buyer refuses to maintain the practice, then you get into all sorts of back and forth. But usually, the Conservation District has seen and has worked with a number of transitions. Typically, the buyer will maintain the practice. That is the most common circumstance.
So these are our cost estimates, and we also estimate technical assistance
assistance costs usually, $50,000 to $60,000 a year to pay somebody, because, the biggest part of all of this is really convincing people to do these things, because it is voluntary. So you need good people, and we have seen, success rates vary wildly depending on who's out there talking to landowners. We had one project up in Rockingham County where we hired somebody, a local farmer, to promote these programs. Well, their farm had cows in the creek. They hadn't implemented the practices themselves, so of course nobody took them very seriously. We didn't make that hiring decision, we just provided the money, but that project didn't go very far.
Why is it voluntary and not mandatory?
In terms of livestock exclusion?
Best practice management.
Well, that's a private property rights, it's up to, and that's.
So does DEQ have any teeth to force folks to do the right thing?
So it depends on the nature of the operation. Certain facilities like there's point sources like industrial facilities or wastewater treatment plants, or what we call CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations. I don't think you have any of those in Rockbridge County.
Yes, we do.
That are permanent.
Well, she just stepped in.
So you have to.
No, as we speak.
Oh, okay.
No, but there are some.
No, there's
there now.
Okay.
We have
None.
coming.
Okay. So I think, and I don't know all the ins and outs of our CAFO permits, but I'm trying to think, I can't think of, now I know there's VPA permitted facilities in Rockbridge County, but I'm not sure that there's any with our federal 50s permit. Those are very large facilities. I think we only have a few in the state. But anyhow, I could follow up on that with you all later. So if you already have a permit, then these TMDL studies do establish caps on how much you can discharge, and you are required to monitor, depending on the nature of your operation, to make sure that you're meeting those caps. But if you fall under that kind of umbrella of non-point source pollution, where you're not a permanent facility, the size of your operation or the nature of your discharge, you are not required to have a permit, then we have the Agricultural Stewardship Act, which is complaint-based, and that is administered through the Virginia Department of Agricultural and Consumer Services. That's right, VDACS. So that's complaint-driven, where a landowner would complain, that there is really an acute issue with an agricultural operation, and staff would work with them to correct that.
We had a straight line situation on the creek. We went through our farm from the neighbor up the creek, and we tried. They couldn't. There was no key. I mean, they continued a straight line right from their bathroom right into the creek.
Now, straight pipes are illegal, so that's a little bit different. And the Virginia Department of Health, if somebody finds a straight pipe and calls that complaint in, they usually try and work pretty cooperatively with the landowner and not evict people from their homes. But that is illegal. So,
yeah, well, that's what you say, but that's not how it gets in.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
Do you know if any counties have a different tax code for farmers who fence out versus farmers who do, since they do the farm use, you get a reduction on your property tax? There's been some talk of that here, and I know there are, and I'm just wondering if you know of any counties that actually have that.
I'm not aware at this point in time. I know that's been a discussion of one way to kind of incentivize things with the Chesapeake Bay TMDL process. But
Is that what's going on in Augusta County on Bobby White's car? Is he kind of looking at that the tax
I
structure?
think that's one of the things that he has suggested that would be very helpful.
Does the DEQ make any estimate of the costs of having impaired streams? And you've got estimates for what it costs to improve the quality, but do you have estimates for the cost of having these impaired with respect to, people having to use UV filters or health costs, that kind of thing? Are there numbers
That's
for
a
that?
great question, and there's
the health cost issue is so tricky to nail down, particularly in terms of bacteria, because, you know, generally people get some sort of stomach bug, and, you know, nobody knows that that's what caused it. But, you know, there has been some efforts to kind of quantify that. I know in the Shenandoah River watershed, several years ago, we had a series of fish kills that were going on. And we worked with James Madison University and a professor there to try and document, you know, what the loss was in terms of the economy, you know, whether it be tourism, you know, fishing guides, things like that, to document that. There's a study out there that she produced on that. And then I know there's some folks with actually the Department of Forestry that specialize in studying what we call ecosystem services, which is really fascinating, very complex. You know, things like if you think about the wetlands, you know, in New Orleans, and the ecosystem services that they provide to the community in terms of controlling flooding. So what's the value of those wetlands? And it's very, very complex. You know, I couldn't even begin to understand all of it myself or summarize it for you all. But yeah, I mean, the efforts are there for sure, but I don't have any of that data.
So that's not part of what DEQ is doing with respect to trying to show an area, or Rockbridge County, for example, you know, how much money is it really costing us having impaired water quality?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're involved in, there are efforts kind of throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed that we're involved in as an agency. There's what we call a Healthy Watersheds initiative, where we are participating in projects where we're looking at the cost savings of keeping a watershed clean, you know, and what services that watershed does provide. So that's not something we have necessarily, you know, a dedicated staff person in my office who does, but there are certainly efforts across the state to document that. Because I agree, that's, you know, it's easy to talk about the cost to fix the problem, but what about if we don't get there to begin with? You know, what are we supporting? Sure.
I spent years at Goshen Scout Camp, and that's where I learned the word ecology. Are they making movements toward helping clean up the calf pasture?
So they were very, very much involved and cooperative participants in the Little Calf Pasture Watershed Plan that we developed, when did we finish that, a couple years ago. They attended all the meetings, they hosted us a few times, and seemed to be on board and were supportive in coming up with some project ideas to manage the lake. And then we were all kind of hustling to try and get a grant proposal in a couple years ago, and it just didn't come together. So we're hopeful maybe that we issue these requests for proposals every year. So I think, you know, the interest is certainly there, and, you know, I can't speak for them. But they never said, no, we're not going to participate in this, we don't support it. They seem to be on board with what's in there.
Thank you.
That's a pretty convoluted response there for you. That's you know,
ears.
where things were left. Well, I'm aware of time. I think I may have already gone. How are we doing on time? I don't want to.
It depends on how much time Sandra needs. It's only at 11 minutes after 6.
So you're good? Okay. Yes.
Is this federal money or state money or a combination?
So, well, there's a number of different programs out there that help fund these things. One of the primary ones that we work through is kind of what you might call a pass-through grant that we get from the Environmental Protection Agency, and then we administer those funds through these grants. But, you know, like you can see, Hayes Creek, just Ag BMPs alone is $6.1 million, and our grant from EPA is usually in the range of $2 to $3 million for the state. So, you know, that tells you it's and these all, we typically, you know, whenever we come up with these timelines, people say, there's always somebody in the room that says, well, I don't want to die before this is done. So I think I've got 10 to 15 years. So we usually come up with about 10 years because people don't want to, you know, they want there to be some kind of push to get people on board. 10 years is still pretty ambitious, that's what I would say.
Do you have any regulations about gray water?
The health department, and I can't really speak to the specifics of those regulations, but there certainly are, like a straight pipe discharging gray water is, if it's not treated, if you're putting cloth diapers in your washing machine, there's still certainly a chance of E. coli getting in the water.
There are other programs that offer funding. Can you name some of those for the same type of
Yeah,
person?
so, we have our septic program that is administered through Soil and Water Conservation Districts or in partnership with the Department of Health. There's also one that's been around a long time is it's called SIRCAP. It's the Southeastern Rural Community Assistance Program. And they do similar things. The primary difference between their program and ours is that they'll provide more support for homes that don't have indoor plumbing. Our programs are typically limited to, outside of the home. So if the septic system is failing, or if they have a straight pipe to put in the system, but it's upon that homeowner to put in the plumbing inside their home that would go with it. And our money is also only available in these watersheds where we have one of these plans too. So SIRCAP is a little more extensive. There's also, county programs like Nelson County for many years, and I don't know if they still have it. When we were working down there a couple years ago, they had a county program that supported septic repairs and replacements too.
And there one from the Chesapeake Bay, because we had a farm at the far end, and we were offered funds to work with the riparian aspect of the Mountain Creek from the Chesapeake Bay Foundation.
Okay. We've given money to them before, and they've gotten grant dollars from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. There's a lot of money swimming around out there through various programs. It's hard to keep it all straight, but
Yeah,
it
one
makes sense.
searches, one can find some of these
Yes.
sources of these resources.
When you said you didn't have good reception to the septic, I guess abatement program that you had going, I don't know if that's the right term, but how did you approach them? How was that done?
So there was a staff person, actually I don't think he's no longer with Natural Bridge District. I think he works for Trout Unlimited now, but he's local. And he did, one of the primary ways that we've done outreach on the septic programs is postcard mailings. I've seen, some folks have done make it look like a coupon, 50% off a pump out and things like that. They get sent out to local property owners. They had what they called night clinics where, you can come and learn about how septic systems work. Some people don't know that you need to pump your septic tank every 3 to 5 years. They don't even know they have a septic system, so trying to educate people about that. But mainly the postcard mailings, that was kind of the primary outreach tool.
Is it ever done where you go door to door or anything like that? Are you allowed to do that?
They've done door hangers. I think oftentimes people are reluctant to do those kind of cold calls. Some of our agricultural outreach staff have done that on farms. I know some have met with a shotgun though. So, that's kind of a last resort.
Those guys, I think they also attended like the farmers carnivals in the communities, kind of these community events where they knew a lot of people locally would be there. And so they tried to have a presence there where they were very kind of community-focused type of events, trying to get some exposure at least and have literature available, another route they've tried.
Yeah, and we're seeing the same thing. Buffalo Cedar Colliers project, that's actually ongoing right now. The Natural Bridge District has money for a septic program in those watersheds. And as I understand it, I'm not managing that grant anymore, but they're seeing similar issues. And I remember when we developed that watershed plan, man, there was huge issues that people said in that Possum Hollow area where you can look at the satellite imagery and you can see those homes. There's no place to put a septic system. There's definitely plenty of straight pipes back there, which Sandra can attest to.
So I'm going back to your first slide where you talked about these statistics we are hearing about tonight cover 20% of our streams. And I'm assuming that's because you just don't have the staff to blanket the area. is there any way, there probably isn't, that you can surmise, based on location, what some of these other streams are experiencing? And I know Sandra's probably going to speak to why we need more citizen monitors, but just hearing that there are 80% of the streams out there that aren't being monitored, it kind of gives me heart palpitations.
Yeah. Yeah, so we have, and I didn't go into a lot of detail about kind of the differences in our monitoring programs, but as part of our kind of biological monitoring program, we also have what's called a probabilistic monitoring program, and that's kind of newer with the agency, but it's a much more random selection of sites across the state, and it allows us to do some more powerful statistical operations to say, well, you know, of our probabilistic monitoring stations, which are randomly located, you know, at different sites, and we're monitoring, when we do one of these monitoring runs, I was out on one last week, we're sampling fish, we're sampling bugs, we're doing water chemistry, we're doing habitat, we're looking at the banks of streams and the materials that we find in the bottom, scraping algae, you know, everything. And that's a really robust data set. And so we use that to make inferences about, you know, all of our streams. But, you know, when you think about just Rockbridge County alone, that 1,800-mile figure, you know, now that, like you said, includes some intermittent streams too, but it's a lot to monitor. We have 2 biologists and 2 ambient monitors, and they stay really busy.
Do any of the monitoring sets discuss nitrogen and phosphorus?
Mm-hmm.
We belong to an organization, my wife and I, where we go out once in a while and do a couple of times and do the cow pasture as an organization to monitor for these things.
And that's, you know, the citizen monitoring data, and I'm not going to steal Sandra's thunder because she can present it way better than me, but you know, it's instrumental, particularly in my program. You know, some of it can't be used for the purposes of designating an impairment on a waterway. It's got to be this, it's got to go through this certification process, and not a lot of these citizen monitoring organizations have the resources to go through that. It's very intensive. Some have though in the state, but we use it quite a bit to kind of fill in the gaps when we do these studies, and it tells us a whole lot. I know the work that Sandra did in the Buffalo told us a lot about where we had string pipes, so it's very valuable.
Do you know if there's a correlation between impaired rivers and streams and impaired groundwater furnishing water to wells and springs?
I don't. I mean, you know, there's plenty of research that's been done, particularly in this area and, you know, in the valley, you know, doing dye tracing studies and looking at the connectivity between our groundwater and these solution channels and sinkholes and those sorts of things. But kind of an overarching statistical analysis, you know, I'm not sure if anybody's done it.
And that's important here in this area where we have limestone caves.
Yes.
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 My question is about the impact of these gravel roads that parallel. There's so many, because Rockbridge County is so steep. The creeks, the roads are right beside the creek, and so many of them are gravel, and then these gully washers come and all the gravel goes in the creek. And what impact does that have? I mean, obviously it's sediment, it's killing all the bugs.
Well, I can say that a gravel road next to a creek is probably better than a paved one. You know, because that gravel is still what we would call pervious surface, so that some of that rainwater is going to soak in. Whereas when you have a lot of pavement, you know, first of all, the pavement's going to be warmer than that gravel, so you're going to get elevated temperatures. You know, there is a lot of research done looking at once you reach that a certain percent of a watershed is paved, you know, the chances that it can support a healthy aquatic community or, you know, go down the drain. So, you know, in that sense, gravel is going to be better. You know, I'm sure there is an opportunity for some material to wash off, but that gravel, you know, the more, what's the word I'm looking for? Not friction, but when you have a surface that's not smooth, the roughness, you know, that's going to slow that water down some. Whereas if it's going across pavement, you know, and there's all sorts of stuff that gets deposited on our pavement, oil, grease, pet waste, sediment, that just washes right off, and that's much warmer water too. Yes?
Do you happen to know of any studies here studying the relationship between autumn olive and nitrates in the water? I know there are a number of, there's some studies in Illinois where they have found
Autumn olive and what in the water?
nitrates.
Nitrates. No.
Autumn olive contributions to nitrates in the water? No? Okay.
Yes.
Maury is heavily used for recreation, as well as tubers and kayakers. Are there times of years, is there a time of year where they shouldn't be on the river? And how would they know not to be on the river, splash around, jump in and swim?
That's a tough question, you know, and in our monitoring program, our ambient monitoring program, where we monitor E. coli, is really designed to assess the overall health of our streams and whether or not they're considered impaired. So our monitoring program isn't such that, you know, like beach monitoring, where the Department of Health's going out constantly and collecting samples throughout the summer, you know, real time, where we can tell you, oh, there's an alert, you know, don't go and swim in this river. So that's something that I think citizen monitoring groups have been tackling more and more, where, you know, they are, there's apps out there that different groups have created. I think James River Association has one.
The water keepers.
The James River Association tests the water at Ben Salem Wayside every week during the summer between Memorial Day and Labor Day, and those results are posted on Friday afternoon on their website, the James River Association. So you can see it varies through the summer. Some weeks are better than others, but it hasn't been bad this year.
Thank you.
More or less.
Thank you.
You mentioned something about PCBs and the yard. Can you give us sort of a short?
Yeah, and let me see, I kind of forgot. Okay, yeah. So future plans for TMDL development, these studies in Rockbridge County. So I've got a few things on my radar. So one project that I'm going to kind of group these streams together is looking at these three benthic impairments. So Moores Creek, Mill Creek, and Marl Creek. Here, these three segments. I'll probably be doing that project, I'm guessing next year, maybe later in the year. And that's something that, you know, if you all have sign-in sheets and you want to be contacted about that, we'll be looking for local participation in that process. But then the Maury River PCB TMDL. So the Maury is impaired for PCBs and fish tissue from its confluence with the South River up above Buena Vista all the way down to the mouth of the James. And so we've done the preliminary sampling for the Maury. We've been monitoring for the past, 2017 and 2018, where we collected water samples and sediment samples from the river. We also collected fish. So we're in the process of analyzing all of that data, and then the next thing we'll do is a source assessment, and we will be doing a TMDL for PCBs. The original plan was to start that process this year, but it's gotten pushed back. So I don't know of the timeline at this point. It will certainly be within the next year that we'll be doing that, but we have collected the data to start that effort.
You don't know any idea of the source?
Not yet, you know, I'm not going to speak to that yet.
You know where it starts, though, where it's showing up.
Where we've collected fish that the concentrations have been elevated enough that we would have that.
Buena Vista, you said?
South River, so it's above Buena Vista, all the way down. And, you know, PCBs are, I haven't had a lot of experiences. This will be my first, well, we're working on one for Lewis Creek as well in the city of Stanton. Kind of doing a slew of them right now, but learning about the sources, you know, most of it's legacy contamination from, you know, old sites before we knew what a problem they were. But figuring out those sources can be really tricky. Yes, back.
Could you go back to that slide that shows the average colony forming units for 100 milliliter of water? I was curious as to whether or not this really tells us anything that we need to know. Because if you look at Walker's Creek, which looks like it's kind of in the ballpark of acceptability, but when you look at the actual data from 2019, we find, for example, that in July of last year, there were 8,456 colony forming units per 100 milliliters of water, which is 40 times the state standard. So even though that number looks good in that averaging sheet, those hard punches of E. coli at 40 times the state standard are really what we really need to be talking about, trying to get rid of or balance back, right? Through some type of program that keeps that reduction down within plausible limits.
And E. coli is really tricky. This, like I said, this is just my best attempt to show you kind of a snapshot, overall. But, those concentrations in the water can vary wildly depending on what flow is like, what's been in the creek. It can, if a cow has just been in there and you sample right downstream, which we have had cases of, you'll see, and a lot of times our citizen monitors will document and take pictures, where we'll get the data and they'll say cow upstream, doing his thing. So you can see those spikes, and depending on the nature of the source, if it's largely runoff driven, so if it's, there's a lot of denuded areas of pasture nearby, then you can see those huge spikes in E. coli when it rains. But, no, you don't want to see that. That's not a good thing, and that's why, more needs to be done.
These aren't flow rated.
No. There has been some research done. I don't know if it includes E. coli, but we have worked with USGS to do some studies using that trend data from those trend stations to look at how flow changes some of these concentrations of particularly nutrients.
Going back to the 20% coverage on monitoring, are you saying that there would be 80% more bars there? So there are streams that we're not getting any monitoring on?
So, we have a 6-year assessment window that we're looking at data that we collect. And so we try and rotate on and off different stations across the state every 2 years. But, that's not to say we're covering everything in that assessment cycle. So we have all of these streams. It doesn't show it on this map, but we have what's called assessment units. And that's where we would look at, and there's no standard size of an assessment unit, but you look at a watershed and a stream, a segment of stream, and say, okay, we're pretty confident if we take a sample right here, that it's representative of this far up of this stream. But, we break those assessment units up. If there's a major tributary coming in 2 miles upstream, then that sample is only going to represent so much of that stream. So that's not even to say, if we say only 20% is assessed, that could be just a portion of a stream, and we're not comfortable saying that represents the whole Maury,
So it could be 50% of the stream was monitored.
Yeah, so we're not going to say one sample. You could go to, the outlet of the James and take a water sample. That doesn't mean you sampled the whole James River, so we divide that up into smaller increments.
Are you familiar with any counties in Virginia where stream impairment has triggered some kind of a health crisis response on the part of the county or the state?
No, I know there was a watershed plan that was done for a community in, I think it was in northern Virginia, or out on the northern neck, where it was on a lake, I think, and there were some serious septic issues, kind of malfunctioning all over the place. And they used this process to really get at what was going on and really correct it. It wasn't a health crisis, not like all these people getting sick, but obviously that's something that when you kind of can narrow things down a bit, that can be helpful.
There were some far southwest several years ago, down in the cold areas. There's several communities that quite sick.
It seems to me that I remember a decade or so ago, hysteria around in the
North Carolina area. Oh, in Rocky.
Hysteria.
So at our second of these, there have been some questions tonight that I think will get answered. The second one is the third Tuesday in October, and We have Aaron Langling from UVA coming to talk about well and groundwater, and Catherine Harbour, our local MD, who's very up on environmental issues and their impact on health, to answer some of these questions, and she might have more details for us.
Let me see, I just want to check, I don't think we're going to get to talk about the Chesapeake Bay tonight. I just want to make sure I've covered all the local stuff there. Yeah, okay. We'll just keep going through questions.
So going back to that graph of the E. coli, and the period of time being from 2012 to 2018, or excuse me, 2011 through 2019, are you saying that all of those streams have been monitored each of those years? I mean, how many sample points are there, say, for a particular
I
stream?
didn't put that above each bar, how many samples were taken from each of those. There's just data in that time frame for each of those streams. I know, like for Hayes Creek, we've been monitoring monthly, probably for that whole period of time. But others, it may be more, it may be less.
And
I could-
then
I
a
could-
trend to see on a particular stream if it's going up or down over a period of time, or?
Yeah, you could certainly do all, I mean, I could put, tens of thousands of graphs up, there's so many ways to tackle it. And I struggled with how to share the information with you all tonight, because knowing 40 minutes isn't a lot of time to summarize all of this stuff. So this was kind of my best attempt. But if somebody wants something specific, a graph for a particular water body, if you all email me tomorrow with requests, it's going to take some time, but, certainly reach out to me and let me know.
Or can we go on the DEQ website somewhere and get this data and do our own graphing?
Yes.
Our data used to all be online, and it's not anymore. And it was a while ago that it was taken, that operation was changed. And I don't think it had anything to do with, some sort of privacy situation. I'm not sure why. My guess is it was a technology thing, but I'm not sure. But no, it's not available. But we are always more than happy to, provide data. You just have to give me a call.
Can you get a dump of the data?
Yeah, I mean, if somebody would like it, you're welcome to it.
The dump of the data, data
I
dump.
can produce massive spreadsheets.
No, I mean, get the raw data.
all the time.
Yeah,
Yeah, okay, great.
Not a problem.
yes.
Just a question. In general, you're talking about PCBs, are you looking at any other persistent organic pollutants or heavy metals or other things like endocrine disruptors in the water and that type of as well? Do you monitor any of that?
Yeah, so I'm trying to remember what we test for in our probabilistic monitoring program. We do testing of heavy metals, and sometimes we do that as part of our benthic stressor analysis process. So if we go out and we're monitoring the bugs and we're seeing issues, then that might trigger us to say, okay, we suspect something might be going on here with heavy metals. Like for example, the Lewis Creek Watershed, which is where I live, in Stanton, we have a TMDL for lead, for sediment, for polycystic aromatic hydrocarbons, and we have PCBs as well. Lewis Creek's pretty beat up, but that was a case where we looked at the bugs, and it's much less expensive and much more practical to look at the bugs first, and then they tell us if there is an issue. So we do monitor those things, but not everywhere.
Do you work at all with any kind of public health issues, so that basically what you're talking about mainly are acute tox kind of reactions, E. coli and different types of other issues. But these are much longer term factors. So PCBs, for instance, you have 10, 20-year latency periods between cancers or any kind of reproductive problems. Are you hooked into anything like that? Have you ever looked at that?
I mean, we work hand in hand with the Department of Health, but we're kind of the monitoring arm of things and doing the assessments and those sorts of things. We don't have epidemiologists and things like that at my agency, but that's certainly very well supported in the state. Yes.
It's kind of, my question is a little bit tied to what he was talking about. It's something I've been worried about for a long time in terms of pharmaceuticals that go through and are not filtered out in the treatment plants. What can you say about that?
I say not a lot. That's not something, I deal with so much. In my role with the agency, we just had a staff member in our central office in Richmond give a presentation just to staff members about those micro-constituents, things like plastics and other chemicals and things that are going to our wastewater treatment plants. It was alarming to me too, so I understand, that...
Well, my understanding is that it's possible to filter them out, but it's very, very expensive and almost no treatment plants do it. So does that mean that I could be getting, I don't know, residual schizophrenic drugs or, birth control or...
A lot of Xanax.
Xanax.
I can't speak to the health implications of those things. I know, we work with treatment plants on more, nutrients and things like that, but yeah, I'm not gonna...
Well, does someone at the DEQ monitor that?
So, wastewater treatment plants have discharge permits, and our permits, to some extent, delve into that, but, some of those chemicals that, that's not typically part of that permitting process, if there's not the technology maybe to treat them. But like I said, I really don't want to speak to that.
I believe it's there.
Yeah. I can show you that it's there, but that's precisely right. The other problem is, it's not even so much what's dumped out of wastewater treatment plants, but without an ROS system, a reverse osmosis system, what ends up happening is if you sample actually people's water, you will find a significant amount of chemicals. And it's not, it's everywhere. Everywhere in our country and everywhere in the world as well. So that's a really critical point to have to try to figure out what's impacting us.
Yeah.
Well,
Nesah, I have wondered, does the Department of Health, when they, if something is reported to them as being a problem, do they come to you to find out what's going on, or do they have their own system?
Depends on what the problem is. Like for harmful algal blooms, we do some monitoring in partnership with them. But, there's all sorts of things that people can call them about that are issues, Well, I haven't left Sandra much time. I don't know how much you needed.
Thank you so much.
Choose the highlights, but we'll attempt to do some today. Just to capsulize a few of her many accomplishments. It's largely on the strength of community interest and involvement created by Sandra that the Virginia Departments of Environmental Quality and Conservation and Recreation have been willing to spend so much of their attention in the Rockbridge area. Sandra was the critical link in getting top priority status to the state to pursue total maximum daily loads for Lake Meriwether and the Little Cat Pasture, Buffalo Collier, Cedar Creeks, and Woods Creek. She was a founding member of the RACC Moores Creek Committee, which persisted for many years and successfully pursued a conservation outcome for the sale of Moores Creek reservoir property, which is now owned by the Virginia State Department of Forestry. Sandra is now the co-chairperson of RACC's Watershed Committee, where she coordinates Maury Citizen Stream Monitoring Program, is exploring scenic river designation for the Maury River, provided the City of Lexington with science-based information on the ecological benefits of removing Jordan's Point Dam, and hopes to develop a karst area overlay protection zone for vulnerable groundwater resources in Rockbridge County. Sandra forged a coalition of Maury Service Authority, county officials, and residents to get drinking water source zone protection for the Maury River. And finally, Sandra has helped organize, energize, and educate the Rockbridge Water Monitoring Initiative that brought you this program tonight. So thank you, Sandra, for your profound contributions to the improvement and preservation of water quality in the greater Rockbridge area.
Thank you, Greg. No, I didn't have this one. I just want you all, it is encouraging to see people interested in this problem. Can you hear me? I have a very
Well,
there's a mic. Yeah, let me use it.
You see the button?
Yeah. Is that better?
Yeah.
I'm much better with depth than that.
Can you just hold on for me?
Give it a shot.
Just hold it.
I'm really glad to see so many of you here interested in this problem. And there are many things that we can do to encourage our neighbors and to open up some conversation about what is going on locally. It's really good that Nesah has been able to tell us what is done with the information that we do gather. And in communicating with DEQ, I can guarantee you they are very responsive. They have been very helpful in any question I've ever asked. The other thing is that we do have 2 official programs that they pay attention to. They're Tier 2, they're considered Tier 2 monitoring. One of them is the benthic program. It's been around for 2 or 3 decades now. Jay Gillum, who started the SOS program in Virginia, has trained thousands of people. And it makes our local group very robust. It's kept it. We have we have sites that some people have been doing since the late 90s, I think. So this is good. We have that local information here. And we don't have to go to DEQ to get it, which is another thing that we've set up recently. Dave Harbour has kept the website at RACC going so that you can go into the RACC website and look at archived information. Go into the website, current projects, and then you will find in there local information that you don't have to dig out of the Isaac Walton League. So that's a really helpful thing to keep our information local if we can. We also obviously reported to for the benthic, we reported to Virginia SOS, and they give it to Isaac Walton, and that's where DEQ gets their information from us. And then very recently, as of last, August, yeah, we had the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay come and train us, those of us who were interested in E. coli bacterial monitoring. They came, we had a good turnout, and we will begin next October. Next month. We begin our monthly monitoring for E. coli. We've been trained to a Tier 2, which again means that the DEQ will look at that information, and where there are hot spots, then they know that they can use their limited resources to come in and see what's going on. If you're interested in either of these programs, we'd be delighted to talk to you about them. The training, Jay Gillum still does for the benthic, and the E. coli will be another year before we do any more training. But you can partner and go out and see if you are interested in doing it yourself in the future. Are there questions? I think Nesah has covered things so well.
Sandra, are there sign-up sheets?
Yes, there are sign-up sheets if you want to. If you are interested, please put your name on there, and we can get in touch with you about anything. Catherine Siegel is here, and she's the coordinator for the Rockbridge Water Monitors.
Oh, me?
Yes.
Your introduction was very impressive, and I'm curious about what you think, given your experience and your knowledge. What's the #1 priority for Rockbridge County in this area?
You're on the spot.
Groundwater, surface water, E. coli, ECDs. What's your
Right now, let me see. I would pick out right now the groundwater. The Natural Brick Soil and Water Conservation District is doing a spring study. We have, over the last, since 1930, we have various studies that have been done in the springs in Rockbridge County. That information has floated around. And so we had a grant from the Army Corps of Engineers to do a spring study when there was a drought in 2002. And that didn't get completed. And so we've hired a GIS group they've collated all of that information from the 11 sources. Once that's done, we wanted to compare it with Fritz Vanderlooten's really remarkable. I would like to recommend that to you if you're interested in anything with groundwater. We'll compare that with what he did with wells and try to update that. And then from there, go to work with some karst experts that we also have good contacts with and see what we can do as far as figuring out an ordinance that we could. Actually, the Planning Commission for Rockbridge County has asked for that. So I would put that pretty high on my list.
Thank you.
But there are other things that are going on that are also interesting and good. Anything else? Yeah.
In your opinion, is the overall water quality in Rockbridge County improving or deteriorating?
It's deteriorating.
You want to expand on that?
Well, that's mostly, I mean, I know my children played in Woods Creek, and I never gave a thought to it. They never had a problem. I see, and it may be just because I know more now, but when I had been, I think it was on Woods Creek, I was doing an E. coli sampling, and I came back, and there were these 3 kids on the edge of the bank. And just the month before, I had had a plating. I don't know if you, this is, y'all are familiar with these Petri dishes. I had had a plate of these, and the little blue dots completely covered it, right above the area they were playing in. And it may have been okay. You know, that day they were playing this. Nesah says, E. coli is very back and forth, but it just, I hope they don't. So that you know, it's a very subjective thing, but it does appear to me that just logically, when you see the cows in the creek and the accumulation of all of that and the poultry barns coming, that we need to be vigilant, in my opinion.
Could you give us a little bit of an idea of what the time commitment is to monitor and what's involved? I mean, not detailed instructions, but...
Yeah, for the benthic, we do a fall and a spring monitoring. If you have a spot that you are concerned about, if you go out, I went out on last week, it took us about 2 hours. You count your bugs, you get them out, you know, just get them out of the creek, and count what you got, and then do some mathematics. It's good to know how to subtract and divide, you know. And then you add up all the things, and then they have a score that whether between 1 and 12, how good your string is. We had a good count last time.
And then you're also doing the Petri dish, right? That takes time too.
The E. coli is a little different. It takes very little time. You can 10, 15 minutes. We do have on this, for the Rockbridge monitors though, we have the addition of some chemical stuff, which will take a little bit longer, I think. Has anybody done it yet?
Somebody just
In
told
class, we did it.
Yeah, but somebody just, maybe they've already gone. Somebody told me they had just done it.
Yeah.
It was Fred Pink.
John Pink.
John Pink, but maybe he's not.
It would take more than an hour to do one sample.
Take about an hour.
Dissolved oxygen, pH, temperature, you can do all that in 30 minutes and you probably take all your samples and be done in an hour, I would think.
Yeah, it does not take as long.
How frequently?
Then driving time.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But again, if you're concerned about, a stream close to you, it's a good way to, if you can get out on a regular. We're doing it during the first week of every month, each of the people involved. So it is a commitment, and you do have to say, I'm going to do it. But it's one worthwhile, I think you would enjoy.
So since I haven't had the training, can I take a sample and bring it to you so that you can?
No, you'd have to have somebody that is doing it.
The way it was collected has
Right,
to be specific.
Yeah, it's a protocol that you have to follow. Although if you have a place that you think needs to be monitored.
Well, I'm most interested in my own creek that runs right by my house.
Yeah, well, that can be a recommendation.
And I know there are cattle in it, and I know that I've seen suds in it, but generally it looks nice.
Yeah, it can be deceptive. Yeah. So, anyone else? I know most of you in here that are monitored, so you probably know more than I do in some ways, at least.
Sandra, I don't want to steal your thunder, but I think for the edification of this fantastic group, I would like to and make sure everyone knows what's happening with the younger set. I'm Elise Sheffield. I get to work at Boxerwood, and there's a great divide, I would say, between adults who we had to learn what a watershed is as grown-ups, right? And what the rising generation understands, and it should give you some encouragement that in Rockbridge and Buena Vista and Lexington, particularly within the Commonwealth, this county, supported by its division schools and county government, is very strong in watershed education for rising youth in combination with Boxerwood. So that every year there are 1,200 kids monitoring streams in Rockbridge County, 600 in the fall, 600 in the spring, at about 12 different sites, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, and high school. And that is every child in the county, right? So they are the children of industrialists, of farmers, of city clerks. And all of them have a positive message through Boxerwood, how we're all helping water, whether we're in the city or we're in the farm. They learn about best management practices. And they also do a simplified children's version of monitoring, both chemical, you can ask a kid, oxygen, phosphates, nitrogen, pH, sediment, turbidity. They know those terms. And also the benthic world. So there are conversations in households going on that are perhaps turned up soil for adult action. So I hope to share that with you. Many of you are supporters for this program already, but that should give you encouragement in your work that the rising generation is with you.
And also, Elise, my kids all did that with you in the program, but the rain gardens too.
And there are many pieces. I don't want to steal your thunder, but it's a multi-age effort, and that's what's cool about our county. So.
That is great. I'm glad you brought that up. At the TMDL public meetings, often Elise will have some of the students come in and have little booths for telling people what's going on. It's always just a delight because they really are educating others. It's a wonderful program. We're very fortunate to have it. Anything else? Thank you all very much.
I'll just say that I really hope to see all these handsome and sweet faces here in a month, the third Tuesday of October, spring water, well water, not spring water, groundwater, well water, and health hazards. Our final one will be in November, also third Tuesday, and that's Joel Salatin, family will tell us what he has done on his farm to address these issues. Thank you so much.